But if you look at the people who labeled anarchist thinkers, 19th century and later, what they were interested in doing is precisely that. They were interested in identifying the different regimes that are exercising control over people and seeking to organize groups to either fight them politically. That's one option. That's maybe the more salient one in the media, but another one is simply to opt out of them.
I was knocking around last night getting this all set up. I didn't think my camera would go wide enough to catch two people.
Oh, that's great. Yeah, we got plenty of room, not kicking each other's knees.
Yeah, it's intimate. Because sometimes if you're on the far side of a table and it's this like great gap, I don't know, it just feels a bit impersonal.
Yeah, well, I think this is great. Is this your first time you've done this in the studio, video?
With video like this. I've done solo video.
Right.
Not the kind of solo video maybe people might imagine, but I've done spoken word stuff.
Go to yellingham.cam.
Yeah, no, I've got a nick. No. Andrew,
yes.
Welcome to the Transformation of Value and to the studio.
Yeah, thanks for having me back again. It's a pleasure.
So just last week, you and I visited an anarchist bookstore in Shinjuku, Tokyo called Irregular Rhythm Asylum. It was, as you could imagine, eclectic, small, poetic. We spent quite a bit of time there browsing the shelves and engaging with the kind of literature that they were stocking. From the outside, it would seem as if the motivations and desires of self-sovereign individuals, Bitcoiners, freedom maximalists, ought to be aligned with what this particular bookstore was trying to do. However, what we saw was this struggle to reconcile what the words anarchist or freedom even mean and what the solutions are. So, optimistically, I am keen to talk with you today about how we can frame these questions of the political spectrum, of the left and of the right, and of freedom in a way that touches the nuance, that builds bridges, that is ultimately constructive.
Well, that's very elegantly put. And I just have to say I was just utterly intimidated by the subject because it really is bottomless. I mean, you start talking about freedom or liberty and their opposites, slavery and bondage. I mean, and it just goes all the way back to the beginning of human reflection on what it means to be a person in the world, bound by laws and nature, living in society, in connection with other people with whom one has to negotiate. I mean, it's really just every single political question back to the very beginning is involved. So it's really, we're going to be spitballing in here. And I think this is a very interesting and very pertinent subject. And I hope that we can together in a Socratic way draw out a number of the just incredibly rich aspects that were of philosophy really in human life together that are evoked by that simple experience in the anarchist bookstore.
Yes, and do please get a little bit closer.
All right.
It's okay. And I guess one additional experience, so again, you and I enjoy walking and talking in this Socratic way. And just yesterday with another friend, I went for a huge walk from Shimbashi all the way to Ueno, which was about 10 kilometers. And again, a very interesting intellectual Bitcoiner, also very moderate in a lot of his views compared to maybe what you would think about Bitcoiners from the outside. And so I am aware that there is, I think, a large, perhaps silent majority of people out there who are neither on neither end of the spectrum in the sense of the political left or right, which I think is also problematic in its own way. But there is a lot of people who I think are seeking out the bridge building, pontification, I guess you could say. And so I guess maybe starting off with some definitions here, because certainly my experience growing up in New Zealand, going to university in Wellington, I mean, it is a left-leaning country, I guess you could say generally. And I know you've been studying the French Revolution. I mean, this is maybe where we could start potentially, this idea of left and right. I mean, starting off, what does that even mean?
Well, it's simply the sides of a room. I mean, the people who were pro-revolutionary or really anti-monarchist ended up congregating on the left of the Assemblée, as it came to be called, and those who were monarchists on the right. So it really was whether one conserves the system or whether one starts anew. I mean, those that began simply a way of talking about the left and right.
Yeah, so in the French National Assembly, there's the kind of, as you say, those who supported the monarchy and tradition sitting on the right of the chamber, which I guess in this case would be you, and then those supporting the left would be...
I'm not actually sure if we're talking like usually in stage, whether we're facing the stage or away from the stage. I'm not quite sure either.
Okay, well, either way, there was this kind of these divisions, and then interestingly, though, that has kind of come through time with us to today, and it's sort of hard to say exactly what that means anymore, left and right, potentially.
Yeah, well, these contradictions are far more even than sides of a room. I mean, they go back into the use of the word freedom, or I think it may be more useful to use the Latin precedent. In French, of course, is liberté, and Latin libertas, and that has two completely contradictory meanings. Of course, the one is meaning unrestrained, and in a Roman context, that basically meant not a slave. So I think coming into the French Revolution, there was a theological, philosophical, social ascendance of Rousseauian liberalism. And this is really a construction, an anthropology that sees people as individuals originally free from culture and from power, and subsequently put into bondage by various accretions around them. And that's so in this case, being free means unrestrained from those accumulated strictures upon them. So that is one sense of the kind of Rousseauian freedom. You have an original state of freedom, in which one has had successive layers of restriction put upon oneself, and then getting free from those is what liberty is. On the other hand, right at the very same time, you have the same words being used for exactly the opposite meaning. And of course, this also goes back to Roman times. So libertas also means, and this seems like a contradiction, but you have to hold it together in the same word. It means privilege, meaning that you have a liberty that has been granted you, either that you've won, that you've bought, that you've accumulated, that you've inherited, which is your right to exercise and to hold. And to remove it from you is taking away your liberties. So, for example, in the Roman Empire, everybody knows the story of how Brutus was among the conspirators against Julius Caesar. Why? They were for liberty. Why? Because the liberties of the Roman people, that means their rights and their privileges to vote and participate in the republican rule, had been removed by a dictator. So somebody had taken away their right to be the decision-making body. And of course, Brutus himself, it's the same name as the first Brutus, who was one of those who founded Roman liberty by kicking out King Tarquin at the very beginning of the Roman Republic. So we have here those completely opposite definitions of the word liberty, meaning the maintenance of long accumulated privileges, and one being freedom from restrictions.
Yeah. So, and again, just keeping
Yeah.
in the sweet spot. Interestingly, that contradiction, I think, is a theme that we will revisit throughout this conversation. This idea that words can have multiple meanings, multiple interpretations. Right. There's sort of the lens you use to view something sort of defines what that word is. And again, we come back to anarchist or freedom, which this experience at this bookstore was really interesting because, I believe you and I certainly have experience, and we're somewhat read in the information, the literature of the so-called left. Yet at the same time, many of the things you would expect to see on the shelves of this bookstore, whether it was economic theories or even some of the freedom movements of the 20th century, were not talked about. And so I felt like there was this sort of gap in this omission as to what was being talked about, or what was within the permissible,
the Overton window.
Within the Overton window of this particular store. And the economic side was certainly interesting. There's probably a lot of threads to pull on there, but even just the idea of freedom and maybe some of the struggle. And I think struggle is yet another one of these words that has connotations, but in particular, say, the Israel-Palestine situation or apartheid, South Africa, the Black Lives Matter, etc. There's a lot of these kind of movements of solidarity or a popular movement that has just kind of a lot to unpack. And it seems as if we've been given a certain lens on it without a rigorous interpretation of the other options, or the other ways of looking at that thing,
Yeah, it's really hard for me to put my the finger on or to really identify, because it really is. I don't speak as an insider, so I'm sure there's an internal discourse there. But if you think of, I think the left liberalism being Rousseauian fundamentally, and that there is a fundamental natural freedom in people that is being restricted by an accumulation of other people's power over one, then getting free from those is really important. So
coming back to Rousseau then, can we speak a little bit about him? So he's French.
Yes,
theorist.
French.
What era was he operating in? What was the context?
This is the 18th century. And he is one of the first modern or maybe proto-romantic philosophers. Putting me on the spot here.
Sorry.
But you have to think of him within the conversation of the time,
Enlightenment,
in the time of the Enlightenment, and in the realm of the absolute monarch in France. So here, there's what's at stake here is a kind of an anthropology. And as well as a political theory that stems from that. So if we can imagine early modern or Enlightenment politics centering on the particular sovereignty of the king, and that as being the foundation or the arche. I mean, arche really means first principle, from anarchism. The arche is that of the sovereign, the monarch, from whom other powers are derived. And so for other political philosophers, I mean, we might include Hobbes here as well, slightly earlier, they're positing other bases for authority. And Rousseau is imagining, and it really is imagining, a different set of political structures built up from the null case of pre-civilization humanity.
So was this an almost Edenic type imagination, that there was once a free Garden of Eden state type thing, and then that was subsequently lost, or is this maybe a little bit more?
No, I think
secular?
I think you might say that. I mean, Rousseau and the French Revolution and revolutionary thinkers in general are either consciously or unconsciously anti-clerical, anti-Christian. However, they're drawing upon that same well of ideas.
Yeah.
Yes, it's very much Edenic.
Interesting. So, because I guess the other way I was thinking about this recently was, perhaps, I don't know if genetic is the right word, but it's like there's a number of people within the population that spontaneously emerge, for lack of a better description of it, who act as governors for popular opinion and sort of push back this kind of hegemonic push and pull of what is acceptable. And so if we all YOLO'd into the next thing and we all just went, jumped on the bandwagon, arguably civilization would never have got off the ground. It required certain structures to hold things back and to deliberate and really think it through. And then it also required a number of people to also push the boundaries. And it was this, long-term push and pull. Who are the ones going out onto the frontier, finding the new territories, and who are the ones staying behind and building up those territories and kind of conserving? There's sort of maybe something a little bit more deeper in the human psyche, potentially. Is this something you've thought about or considered?
Well, I think to put it in the terms of contemporary psychology, you might say one is open and one is conscientious. And so we know in personality science, in as much as it seems to me that there are people who are more open to the world and open to new experience, and are seeking new ways of seeing and of being and of creating. You might think of that in an evolutionary sense of the scouts or those who are in a genetic line, even an experiment.
Fast twitch or slow twitch muscles, right? It's potentially.
Yeah. Well, I mean, So the notion that that's very deeply embedded in us as people in our nature, I think that doesn't seem implausible to me at all. And I think politically, there are those two poles that stasis is death. And this is something that the pre-Socratics were very clear about. I mean, if you have, and even like Dante, for example, in the Divine Comedy, it's quite interesting that Satan, after the descent into the Inferno, it's not burning hot where Satan is. Satan is ice, frozen. There's no movement. And the opposite of that, of course, is you ascend through purgatory and then enter the Empyrean. What do you see when you look up into the sky and see the sun and the stars moving? They're moving, they're brilliant, they're hot, they're full of energy. So, I mean, stasis is death.
Well, that's interesting, though, if we pull on that thread, because, again, in the context where we are in Japan, certainly it's an ideologically static place. And sort of reflecting on how it's quaint in the sense that it feels like we are still in maybe the early 2000s in this kind of weird place where we have smartphones and a few other things from the current moment. But for the most part, everything seemed to have stopped in that late 90s, early 2000s period, and maybe even arguably earlier with the war and this kind of amnesia of state Shinto and all of these massive revolutionary things that were happening prior. And I mean, again, Japan in the 1930s was an incredibly politically tumultuous place. There was a whole lot of different kinds of movement. And arguably in the 1960s, there was the student riot movement. But as of today, I don't see anywhere anything getting close to resembling any kind of political innovation or ideological discussion. And so our bookstore in Shinjuku, a lot of the books on the shelves were reminiscing of the earlier period, or overall it just had this sense of staticness. It was just a bit old.
It was nostalgic. Yeah, I think there's again, I think a bookstore like that is a bit of a museum. And I mean that in the best possible sense. I mean, I love museums, but it does seem that it is something that's past and which is being kept up through out of love and loyalty, maybe in a very peculiar sort of Confucian fashion here. These are the people and the voices that formed those who participate in that particular society.
That's fascinating. And I guess, though, sort of what then is the site of ideological discussion? Because, I mean, they do poetry readings, they have people come through, and I mean, certainly it's a well-known destination for people who are into this kind of thing.
Yeah, well, they're the very small niche of which Tokyo has all of them.
Yes. And I mean, you can find all sorts of things. Again, Tokyo has everything for everyone, but this kind of idea that this maybe isn't a site of ideology, or am I being judgmental here when I say I don't see the ideology happening there? Because there is certainly things being written and spoken about. And
well, it depends whether you're a Fabian anarchist or a Leninist, I guess, huh?
Yeah. Speaking of that, though, I mean, we were talking about Fabianism the other day. I mean, how would we describe that? What does that concept mean?
Well, you would know as well as I simply know the definition of the word. Basically, you infiltrate the institutions and you take it over from the inside, as opposed to leading some kind of popular revolt and exercising a coup of some kind, taking over.
Yeah, so this comes back to the Fabian Society and this idea that maybe there's the slow march of the institutions, and this would be something familiar to listeners maybe in so-called Western countries, where you do have this penetration of academia with leftist tints. Certainly that was my experience in university. The first day of class, they said that by the end of this degree, you will all be Marxists. And so I've often reflected on that because I was, in a sense, inoculated early on. And in that naive stage, you're 19 years old and someone starts talking about Guy Debord or, culture studies, you're going to take it, lap it up, right? Well,
not only are you going to lap it up because you're naive, but I think people who aren't pure psychopaths, to some degree, want to please their elders or superiors. And even among the revolutionary left, you get this sort of deference to authority. And I think if that doesn't exist at all, it is psychopathic. I mean, writ large. So I think I see this a lot in institutions. When the left or leftist ideology becomes institutionalized, it's clearly supported by oddly enough, by conscientious youth who are deferential to authority. So you get this odd ideological leftism, but it's really very, very socially conservative. And I think that's what you get in the university. And there's nothing more conservative than the university. I mean, it's just like socially, you have these systems of advancement, which are maybe sometimes hundreds of years old. And granted, there's a certain claque that's maybe taken over new disciplines. And this is why, in fact, there has been a lot of creation of new disciplines. It's because the old ones you can't take over. You have to create new ones.
Well, that's interesting because, again, there's a lens which, for me as a creative person, I can sort of see both of these things at the same time. But classic arguments of, say, patriarchy and these kinds of things, when really it is, in a lot of cases, older male professors leading this ideological thing in the universities. And that structure, as you say, is often not critiqued itself, or it's only superficially critiqued in a playful way. And I think that is actually at odds with what you and I see as maybe true critique, or maybe intellectually rigorous critique, where we actually look at it and, I've got Karl Marx sitting there on the shelf, I'm reading what these people are saying, I'm trying to digest it and synthesize it for an actual better outcome. And it's sort of like they are actually the conservative ones who are holding on to a structure, and we are the ones maybe, and I say we, sorry, it's creating us and them, but you see what I'm saying? It's sort of, how do you actually critique the thing itself without ousting yourself as a provocateur?
Well, I don't know quite how you do that. We had a guy who was teaching at my graduate school, and in a very posh position, who was spouting off very revolutionary ideas. And somebody finally said, well, if you're so interested in empowering minority voices, why don't you resign and let one of them have your job? Right. So, which is a bit absurd, but certainly provocative. But I mean, that's kind of the point, right? This exists within this realm of this hierarchical, very conservative, well-established path of advancement.
Yeah, I feel like we're beginning to take pot shots, and I think I do want to bring it back.
I just mentioned that. I mean, that's not I think that's not you, kind of writ large, but I mean, that's anyway. Continue.
Yeah. No. I guess what I'm saying is, because we started off with this. It's like, okay, can we build bridges? Because I certainly, I've got more things to say like that. Critique of it, but I guess coming back to this large silent majority of people who are generally just conscientious, and again I think of like Kiwis generally are pretty nice people, I guess you could say, and there is this idea of the social realm and the social contract. It's not a dog eat dog, sink or swim kind of situation in that culture, and I think a lot of these people may confuse what we're talking about when we say, well, the left is this thing, when actually it's just kind of human decency that's in there, and the ideology is the thing that's perverting it. And I guess bringing that back, I mean, the challenge here with the left and the right is it creates labels, and in a way it reduces the ability to communicate, because you're starting to create labels through which you can judge somebody. You can say, well, look, this person clearly isn't one of us, and so we can't have a dialogue. And I think that's what I'm trying to break down here. And so the middle way, I mean, coming back even to the French Revolution, was there at that time, was there a middle way? Was there a synthesis between those two sides? Like, how were they, what was the vector through which they communicated?
Well, the middle way in the French Revolution was the path that was not taken, which was that of constitutional monarchy. I mean, there was a very strong party leading up, this is before the Terror, before Robespierre takes over, that wanted to maintain the monarchy and have the king have right of veto, but basically have a smooth transfer of power. And whether that was possible or not, I don't know. I'm not an expert enough to say. But but yeah, that path was definitely there. It's a path that England took, and that England was definitely their model. And the question of religion was extremely important there, and to what degree the king was able to give up his own freedom of faith and his obedience to the Catholic hierarchy in order to be a constitutional monarch. Really, that was central to the question for him personally. And I think one might say that it was forcing the question on the king whether he was going to obey Rome or whether he was going to obey the Assemblée Générale, because the priests were made to take an oath to be obedient to the French people. And from a Christian perspective, I mean, it's quite understandable that they would have problems with this, because they are ceding what for them would be the ultimate authority to a secondary authority, and that's just idolatry, pure and simple. So, or at least the reversal of the proper order of things. So pushing that issue in particular was central to radicalizing the radicalizing the revolution.
Yeah, interesting. So you mentioned England, and then I'm reminded of the American project.
Right.
And just reflecting, the other day, I met with a couple from Belarus, and it was interesting because it was perhaps one of the most intense conversations I've ever had in my life. And this idea of secondhand trauma really came through. These people, really lovely people, and they had grown up in a repressive communist regime, and the history of Lukashenko and many people aren't even aware where Belarus is, its relationship with Russia, the Soviet Union. But that was a really hard case, and something struck me that for them growing up and for their parents, going to Czechoslovakia was like going to paradise, and yet Czechoslovakia itself was a Soviet satellite state, and this kind of despotic place. And so that was just to highlight the difference and just how bad Belarus was. But what it made me reflect on was my own situation in New Zealand, where even though I despise the New Zealand government, at the end of the day it has inherited this enlightened English tradition of common law, of structures and institutions, and it does kind of work. And as much as the COVID years were really hard for me, and I really had a lot of issues with the government, the fact that they've opened up a royal commission to critique it themselves and to kind of review what happened is very interesting and kind of hopeful and optimistic, I think, in one sense. But at the same time, the government of New Zealand has certainly over the last few years become a lot more, I guess you could say, left-leaning, even though we've got a so-called centrist government. And it's sort of like we have the bones of a very good system, yet it feels like over time that is decaying without kind of renewal, if that makes sense. Sort of, it was set up in a very good way, but maybe we've lost it over time.
Well, I mean, there's several different angles to look at that. One is, you could say, it's the typical story of decadence, in the sense there's a period of efflorescence and greatness and this convergence of virtue and wealth and capacity that constitutes itself alchemically into some kind of cultural and material gold. And then after that, you have this sort of inevitable decay. I mean, that's the story we inherit of the Roman Empire. I think it's a very old human story. There's always kind of the golden era story. That's combined with the fact that, to put it in a very anodyne way, things change, right? We are in a different technological regime, or in a different material regime. It's almost even impossible to compare the level of wealth and comfort and many kinds of traditional freedoms, freedom from negative freedom. It's probably at a height as it ever was in human history. Even among repressive regimes, people are living relatively long lives. In their private life, they can do many things, not everything, but there are always restrictions on that. So it's in the case of New Zealand or in the case of America, is it perfect? Of course not. Could it be better? For sure. Is there some immediately realizable alternative that is guaranteed to be better? not necessarily. So yeah, I don't think there's any clear revolutionary way forward, as much as the rhetoric, that sort of rhetoric seems to be amplified.
Yeah, sure. And I feel like we are still sort of circling around different ideas here that are, again, very complex. But I wanted to ask you if you're familiar, not to put you on the spot, but are you familiar with the film Hypernormalization?
No, I don't know one at all.
Okay.
Inform me, and if it doesn't take us too far.
Yeah, no, sure. So this was a film that's actually been sitting there waiting for me for a long time. It's 2016 BBC production, directed by Adam Curtis, who's a well-known documentary filmmaker. And I watched it just the other night, and this came alongside several things that happened, again, meeting this couple from Belarus and a couple other things I had been going through. And so this film, Hypernormalization, was really quite profound for me, and it really posits this idea of the theatre of politics in a very culture studies kind of a way. You know, there's the theatrics of the left and the right, and again, there's kind of stagecraft, the mise en scene of politics. And then what that has actually done is it's masked the underlying reality of what is effectively the post-Soviet, dichotomy of a world where there was a counterpoint to capitalism, I guess you could say. And so, again, this is something Mark Fisher and others have written about, that it's easier to imagine the end of the world than the end of capitalism. And the kind of consumer culture that we're in today, that it's sort of, Japan is certainly in that world. There is no alternative ideology or belief system. There is no revolution. Everything's just consumption. And hypernormalization really explores this in the sense of, the wars and the expeditions into the Middle East. It's sort of the pure fantasy of it all. There were no weapons of mass destruction. It was clearly just a setup. But people have given up the critical ability to see that, and it's sort of merged with this Hollywood kind of thing where it's just movies and it's just good guy and bad guy. And what that has done is masked true political revolution. Like, we don't see organic revolution come out like we saw once upon a time. And so sorry, there's quite a lot of information, but
no.
You see where I'm taking it.
Yeah, I'm serious. I'm taking it. Actually, that segues quite well to a talk of anarchism generally. And I think that the term is polluted somewhat with connotations of chaos and violence. Of course, recently in America, the so-called anarchist riots that were happening in the West, in Portland in particular, have usurped that title. But if you look at the people who labeled anarchist thinkers, 19th century and later, what they were interested in doing is precisely that. They were interested in identifying the different regimes that are exercising control over people, and seeking to organize groups to either fight them politically. That's one option. That's maybe the more salient one in the media, but another one is simply to opt out of them, which is to say there are groups and individuals who are neither seeking to foster a revolution nor to change how the world is run, but simply to create their own reality, kind of aside to that. And I think that within that, I see the crypto anarchists, for example, speak of themselves like that, creating an alternative reality where the state in its certain manifestation just is unable to enter.
Well, again, I've got Crypto Sovereignty here, Crypto Sovereignty by Eric Kaysen, which explores that concept. This is something others have explored. Samuel Edward Konkin, who's well known for the agorism movement. And for me, again, this is where we go to this bookstore, and I'm reminded of these same sorts of places on Cuba Street in Wellington, and I'm imagining Portland and other parts of the US have this kind of bohemian, hippie, anarchist thing. But the true anarchy that we're talking about right now, and true, sorry, that's kind of a strong word, but I get the
maybe an alternative, but less maybe less salient or less less stand out in the current discourse.
Yeah, so the less standout anarchy that we're talking about is opt out and basically self-sovereignty. And again, that's where on the shelf of these stores I would ought to expect the sovereign individual and the Bitcoin standard and crypto sovereignty and all of these texts that we're familiar with to sit there, because they don't require coercion. And I think this, maybe we can get to this, but ultimately what is seen with a lot of these progressive ideologies is that it's helping the majority by taking from a guilty minority. And this sort of idea that the state, and whatever the state means, is the arbiter of that. And so it actually plays into a sense of statism when you're rioting to whatever movement, Black Lives Matter or Israel Palestine, whatever side you take, whatever you think about it, you're sort of going out and performing to this kind of sun king who's going to somehow arbitrate that situation.
Sorry, a lot there to unpack. There's an assumption of state power, and I think what's behind that is a similar populism, perhaps, that was another side of the French Revolution, but also a side of empires, going back again to the prime example, which is, of course, Rome. I mean, the most hated emperors from today's perspective, like Caligula, for example, or Nero, were famous. The reason we hate them so much is because Suetonius, who wrote the lives of the emperors, painted them in a very bad light because they had so usurped the privileges of the senatorial class more than others, and had made clear what was clear under Augustus, that the Senate no longer ruled, but in fact the emperors ruled. But another aspect of this, and this is something that's also quite missed in all this talk of empire, is that those emperors were populists in the sense they knew that their power derived from the approval of the people, and Caligula and Nero in particular were famous for putting on games, for their own showmanship. Nero himself was famous for wanting to and racing in the chariot games. He went to Greece and performed in the Olympics and won all the events, of course. But I think bringing it into the realm of the theatrical, I think it fits in that quite well. And there is something, I think, about us as humans that desire that, and the people and pleasing the people kind of goes hand in hand with that kind of dictatorial power, it seems to me. Anyway, I got a little off track there. But the notion that somebody, the king, or maybe a Politburo, empowered by the will of the masses, can come in and solve all problems, or all the big problems, I think is a big, a major part of that particular revolutionary, maybe in this case anarchist fantasy.
Well, interesting though. I mean, we're seeing that same thing play out with Trump right now, though. I mean, he is the king who will fix all problems with his Doge and his cadre.
Yeah, he's certainly being invested, to use a charged word, with all kinds of authorities, which he doesn't naturally have. But I think he has is conscious, either consciously or unconsciously, perfect player in that role. And I think that's something, and you can see this in how incensed people are against Trump. I mean, people are really unhinged by him. And I think some perspective on the theatricality of politics going back to Rome kind of puts that in perspective.
So this is interesting. So this does connect back to hypernormalization, which again, I don't usually recommend films to people, but this is one I certainly think everyone should check out. It's on YouTube for free, and it really does speak to this theatrics. And again, this is where I wonder whether my training and my time in the institution, I guess you could say, has given me somewhat of a lens where I was in the beginnings of being trained to encode these messages. And now on the side of freedom and Bitcoin, I'm using that skill to decode these messages. And I think people do get caught up in the theatrics and the mise-en-scene. And arguably, this is where the performance of, again, the left we think of in the popular imagining of, protesting down, on the street about Gaza or Ukraine or whatever it is, there's a performant aspect to it. And then also a lot of these people, especially in their younger years, maybe they're into theatre, they're into arts, they're into literature. There's certainly a lot of crossover, because when we do take the self-sovereign angle, it's like, well, I don't care about any of that stuff. I'm just opting out. And you're not even in the room. You're not even in the theatre. You're outside doing your own thing. And that doesn't have any visible surface area with which to attach ideology to. And so it's not relevant. It's not seen. Right. And it's like this idea of being seen or not seen, and the theatre of it all is kind of what we're talking about here. And then but that is all nice until it gets to the real aspect of violence, warfare, coercion, when actually people get hurt, right? So sort of like that, the imagined reality of the theatre of the political world, and then the base reality of blowing people away, and the camps. It's sort of like, how often do we have to repeat that experiment to remind ourselves?
Yeah. Certainly, I think I'm trying to figure out a handle to grab after that one. It's certainly. The theatricality of a lot of activism is it's very clear if you just take one step back. And certainly you see this in the kind of signaling that anybody in particular, the signaling that people, the messages you get from people about where they stand on this or that. It's part of how we identify and create our sociality.
Performance. Interesting. So I wonder if there is something here, though, where we take this idea of the theatre and the performance, and then we run that through the Bitcoin lens, because, again, I'm looking to build bridges here, and it's like, again, these people are my friends. I've grew up with a lot of these kinds of people, and I say it in that sense, it seems like it's an us versus them, but I don't see that. It's just these. Now that I'm kind of more into Bitcoin stuff, it's allowed me to see what they're doing from this third place. Right. And I think this third place is, again, what the agorists would call the second realm, outside of the purview of the state. It's just person to person. Right. The Bitcoiners would call it the peer-to-peer network.
Yeah, and I think the anarchists would call that the anarchist society. I think there's one of the reasons why I think there's such maybe animosity between traditional anarchists and maybe the neo-crypto or internet anarchists is that there's so much the same. Yeah. And I think you see this quite clearly in you've spoken of, and we have spoken together a lot of trying to identify the state, to see the state, as James Scott would say, and to point out where it exercises its authority. And I think a lot of 20th century thought, 19th and 20th century anarchist thought, has really gone towards that identification. Of course, it's a state that is caught up necessarily in all the forms of power that exist, including economic. And so it's quite easily identified and confused with some large idea like capitalism or even communism, socialism in its era. And so I think there's a real affinity, because that anarchist movement from the 19th century really begins with an identification of the state and its power, and seeking in groups. There perhaps maybe where the differences begin, but seeking groups to identify and to bring conscious awareness to that.
Yeah. I guess one other thread I wanted to pull on, you and I have both been exploring the works of Jacques Ellul, a French theorist who wrote the book on propaganda, which I got here. And I know you've read some of his other writings, and this, I think, is really quite important work, and I've got highlights on almost every page here, exploring really what are the characteristics of propaganda. And what he identifies is that propaganda isn't a thing that we can necessarily point at. It's not an object out there. What it is, it's a sociological function, and it's within all of us, and it's always existed. And this is where I come back to this, time immemorial idea that maybe there's certain types of people who are open and people who are closed. And he talks a lot about how the technical way, the scientific way with which this sociological function, this human function, is utilized by the technological state to achieve certain outcomes. And I think this is very interesting because it sort of gets away from this finger pointing of them and us, and especially when, for someone like myself, you grow up, you're 19 years old in Wellington, New Zealand, you do go through the crazy left-wing period.
Yeah, well, I think, as somebody said, if you're not a liberal when you're 20, you're heartless, and if you're not a conservative by the time you're 50, you're a fool.
Yeah. So there's this sort of, there's this graduation people go through, and what you realize, there is so much human nature to it. And so it feels as if anything that tries to engage with it as an object or as a thing that can actually be manipulated away from the human nature of it, it's sort of like it's almost like a fool's errand. And instead, there's two ways. One is that you work in the playbook of the state, where you run it and you utilize it for your own needs, or it's like, is there some other thing that you could do to engage with it?
Right. The 2 points there. I think again, propaganda is on my reading list. I've read his foundational book called Presence in Society, and I think there he lays it out in a kind of programmatic way, saying that this regime of means, everything is a means towards an end in the technological society, and we begin to think about everything in terms of how it will achieve some kind of imagined goal. And there's been a usurpation of that way of thinking from the world of engineering, practical, applied science, into people. And it's assumed, and this is how it's imbued in how we think about what society is. I think we tend to think of society a little bit like a machine, or maybe now more like a computer or a person, like with a head and a central processor, and those models really kind of take over our own consciousness. And his point being in that book is that is the mark of the technical society, is this instrumentalization of everything.
That's fascinating. It's sort of, again, the model of cities, of societies as connected to the dominant form of technology is fascinating, because that would, obviously the computer chip, the central processing unit, it maps onto the centralized roles of the state, the subunits of the motherboards, and even the way you have, say, highways of information. But what does that mean as we enter into the new Bitcoin world and the decentralized world?
Yeah. Well, again, those are the kinds of things we don't know until they've happened, because we don't. People are still people, and I think that if you're going to bet on the future, 9 times out of 10, your bet's going to be right if it's about the past. That's going to continue in one particular way. So I guess there are certainly challenges to the way in which that technical society has been organized. I was just listening to an interview the other day with a woman who'd written a book on called Letterpress, and it was Ferguson is the name, I believe, and it was about anarchist printing. And she realized, she was a scholar, an historian of the anarchist movement in America, and was really surprised to find that anarchists were really obsessively interested in printing. And she sort of stopped counting at like 168 anarchist presses, right? Because they all want to have their own. I mean, one of the reasons maybe when the wind has been taken out of this anarchist sails since in the past 30, 40 years, and that it has perhaps been radicalized in other ways, is that kind of printing press is now ubiquitous. I mean, anybody can put up their own newspaper their own webpage,
website,
blog, their Nostr post or whatever. I mean, anybody. It's basically free, and it is relatively uncensored. Whatever the platforms can be censored, but the dark web not really at all. So anybody can participate in that. So that's really, I think, where that self-expression has an outlet now that it never had.
Yeah, interesting. I mean, I guess as we talk about it, I'm just reminded that there is this myth of rationality, and then at the end of the day, humans do act on this more primal operating system, this more emotional operating system. And again, the technology and the rational science of cryptography, of software, these things that are binary and Boolean, they don't, there's a right answer. The software works or it doesn't. It's very mechanical, and it's kind of almost the end state of this Enlightenment kind of scientific movement where we can have atomic structures in a virtual system. It's not even reality anymore. It's like hyper reality, and that can be maybe very confusing for people who want to return. And I think this is a human thing. Return to something more magical or spiritual or kind of humanist. Prior to all of that, like we still have that operating system. So there's kind of this kind of conflict, and maybe this is the contradiction we come back to. Like, people want to seem to be rational and scientific and logical, but actually there's always this thing bleeding through that's just irrational potentially.
Yeah. Again, so many handles. This speaking of freedom and of liberty really goes back to the foundation of human reflection upon who we are. And among the first divisions in classical philosophy is between those who believe that we are and have agency, and those who don't. And you may easily divide. The pre-Socratics already had this laid out before Plato and Aristotle. You have the Epicureans who think that we do, and the Stoics who think that we don't. The Stoics were basically acted upon, and we are part of nature, and everything is decided in a certain way. And we have some agency in a response, but basically not. And the Epicurean, I guess ultimately Aristotelian sense of freedom, and that no, there's a will that's there that has some agency and can act and also be and take responsibility, be responsible and take responsibility.
That's the two sides of the liberty we started with.
Yeah, it's they exist. They're very primal, and I think if anybody wants to see all of this rehashed in its primal form, simply go back and really read the pre-Socratics on society, or if you want the Cliffs Notes, the Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy has a couple of very good articles.
Yeah. Well, that's fascinating. And I guess come back to this idea of a nuanced reflection and kind of the reality of, friends and people that I know who maybe have this myth or this idea in their mind that they're on the left, and whatever that means, who feel as if something like Bitcoin or freedom technology, Nostr, privacy, that somehow that's at odds with their project. These are the bridges that I'm interested in helping build, and it's perhaps a bit of a impossible task, but how can we maybe communicate this? Like, I know, and especially with Bitcoin, there's a few people who've talked about, the progressives' case for Bitcoin is one book, for example, but it sort of seems as if there's still this mass rejection of the emancipation power of Bitcoin. And again, in this bookstore, it was cash or you could pay with Visa. And I thought that was so ironic that they weren't accepting Bitcoin for payment.
Yeah.
And they're using the Visa, they had the little terminal there.
Well, I think there, again, I don't think it's necessarily profound or essential to any particular anarchist movement. I think it has to do with an identification of money in any of its forms, in any way that it's talked about, with systems of power and oppression that need to be resisted. And so money and by extension, things like property and various kinds of rights are kind of suspect. And it doesn't help that cause that there's a lot of arch capitalists who are quite interested and involved in Bitcoin, and so it's sort of tainted as this scammy speculation. Anyway, it's by association, I think, only, and the way that these things work are mostly by association, not by analysis.
Interesting. I mean, because one of the sort of things that I can see though as an opportunity is if we do come back to the theatre. So we sort of we go back into the cave and we look at the theatre and we say, well, maybe the performance of some of this, again, so-called left stuff is actually an opportunity, and this is maybe people like you and I who can maybe straddle both worlds, and others might argue that it's a waste of time, but it's like actually telling the stories. And this is where I look at an organization like the Human Rights Foundation, who are pro-Bitcoin, yet they are also very much aligned with a lot of this kind of amnesty stuff and human rights and kind of a lot of the talking points of our friends on the left. And they are sort of Trojan horsing it and kind of normalizing it, because I think with enough time passing, I mean, all of these stories, if Bitcoin is just there and it just comes through over time, maybe it just gets normalized. So it's, instead of evangelizing, it's sort of normalizing the idea of Bitcoin as
Fabian Bitcoiners.
Yeah, a Fabian movement for Bitcoin, maybe.
Again, I take a naturalistic view towards these things. They have to emerge in the way that they do for ways that really can't foresee. I think there's I'm neither of the left or the right really, and I find the discourse as it's usually taken place publicly to be very frustrating, because I have a lot of personal sympathy with many left-wing causes or concerns. I'm also very sympathetic with a lot of libertarian or liberty or even that side of what's traditionally considered right-wing causes. I mean, I don't line up anywhere. You know, there's no panel of candidates I can get behind. You know, but part of being involved in politics is dealing with compromises, and one makes coalitions. Mm-hmm. I'm actually reminded when you talk about this of the frustration in the refusal of certain institutions or viewpoints that should naturally be for a sovereign kind of store of value, such as Bitcoin, with the green movement and its anti-nuclear stance. I think there's definitely some history behind that. There's a lot of hidden, I think, degrowth and concern mostly about population that were sort of Trojan horsed into the green movement and got into a stance against more energy, because that would make it easier to have more people and for there to be more damage upon the planet. And you see that now having very ambiguous results, both geopolitical and environmental, when you get this perverse case of, for example, in Germany, a Green Party supporting the coal lobby or being supported by the coal lobby, and eventually ending in alliances with large Russian gas companies. It's a very strange alliance where you would think that sovereignty, energy sovereignty, and again, I'm just leaving aside any concerns that people have over whatever their viewpoint on nuclear energy may not be, but it seems to be a natural win-win for environmentalists.
Yeah, interesting.
But it's not.
Well, I wonder again, though, this is where this encoding and decoding, this kind of structuralist, post-structuralist thing. Like I can see that there is screenwriters and puppet masters who are orchestrating things that maybe, as it drips down to lower levels, they don't see the inherent contradiction, or they're unable to see it. And I guess what I'm saying is, yeah, this idea that the Green Movement, rejected nuclear and has kind of embraced coal, and even when it comes to Bitcoin, there was the whole thing with Greenpeace and being against proof of work. And it's like, one way is to just, step aside from all of that, and the other way is to actually produce narratives and kind of put in the work. And again, arguably, whether it's a waste of time or not, I don't know, but actually being able to tell stories that kind of, it's like the counter narratives or like higher level storytelling that actually brings that in, and kind of stories of hope, stories of emancipation through Bitcoin and freedom technology, and how it actually feeds in to a lot of the goals that these people at a lower level may have. Because arguably at the higher level of some of these organizations, there is maybe even an anti-human sentiment, like the degrowth that you talked about. If you actually outline what decarbonization means, which is, no people, for example, which is quite a shocking thing to really encounter, that actually that's what they're trying to do. When someone actually thinks, hey, I just want to have a nice environment and like clean water and stuff, it's like, no, decarbonization means getting rid of the people. You realize that. You see that there's a sort of at a higher level, there's, I don't want to go too deep into it, but there is like a nefarious kind of Malthusian anti-human thing at the top. And if we can slot in stories that kind of counter that, stories of hope, of growth, of optimism.
Well, and I think those are fundamentally what certain strains of anarchism actually are trying to do. They're trying to show
solar punk kind of.
Just to show and demonstrate the possibility of human flourishing and freedom, despite the regimes that have power over us, living and finding our freedom in this. I mean, oddly enough, one of an image that comes to mind, and it's extreme, but Viktor Frankl's Man's Search for Meaning begins with his realization in the concentration camp that he still had some agency within that prison, and within some of the worst conditions humans have ever endured. And that realization, I think, is at the heart of a lot of this particular movement. And I think it's something that freedom, I mean, I say it in the broadest sense, both in the sense of the preservation of privileges, but also in the sense of limiting power over others, and working towards that. I think they can come together.
Yeah, man. I think we're coming back to our original opening kind of planning for this, talking about these words, what they mean, how we can frame them, how we can build bridges. I guess I don't know. Have we built bridges today? Have we stood on the banks of the river and looked out in awe at just how far across it spans? I don't know, man. Like, I
don't know. I think instead of like building bridges, I think that you might say there is no river. I mean, there's something about the divide that is. I think in some sense humans are. I think there is something binary in the conscientious and the open characteristics that are somewhat part of our character, but I think we all live in the same world, and a lot of what's going on is a lot more heat than light, and some of the conflict is just manufactured.
On that note, I wonder if, again, we come back to the internet as perhaps the revolutionary technology of the 20th century, and people like John Perry Barlow, the technical internet utopians who saw decentralization and empowerment and all of these things, which we have gotten with the internet, but then we've also gotten a whole lot of not that. Yeah. And I wonder whether Bitcoin, in a way, actually does that exact same thing, where it's money for Trump and Mark Andreessen and all of these and all of these billionaires that are playing around with it, but it's also money for people who are unbanked or debanked or enemies of the state. And it just, again, it's money and technology for everyone. And along the way, that becoming ubiquitous actually leads to a lot of the positive outcomes that maybe we can imagine, but currently are obscured by political theatre. In a way that the internet itself as well brought about a lot of positive changes. The world's a much safer place, much more connected place, even though it may not seem that way. And so I wonder whether the sort of, stay humble, stack sats, and just use Bitcoin, it's almost like that is the solution in itself potentially here.
I I think there's really no other way. That's just the way. I mean, that's the way that it's going to happen.
Yeah.
But I think the internet. If you think about politics, I think one of the effects, one of the consequences of our own human limitation is that we really have a very limited real social network. We don't relate to more than a gross of people, so to speak, and it's difficult for us to imagine larger societies in that. And all of us live in. When we're in Tokyo, it's 40 million people. I mean, the number of people that I saw this morning in Shinjuku Station is more than somebody an early human would have seen in their entire life. And in that case, we see the highest level of politics because it's always on. Even in the train, you see the picture of the president, but you don't see the mayor of your town. You don't see the counselor. You don't see, for example, the head of the board of physicians who's disciplining the doctors. You don't see all of the layers of politics and the disputing powers that exist up and down the line, both economic and political. And it's difficult for us to have consciousness of this. And I think one of the things I really take comfort in actually is in the disputatious and the lively disputation of all of those levels of political action and friction. And I think in that and in participation and knowledge of that really lies a lot of, I think there's a lot of hope there, not in somebody coming from on high and swooping in with big ideas to solve all problems, but in participation in those multi-layered power games.
Mm. Yeah, I fully hear what you're saying with the localism. Mm-hmm. I mean, I'm a big believer in the power of in-person meetups, talking, conversation, and again, this is where I think that lens of the theatrics, of the mediation, of the Hollywoodification of it all, is almost, it is a distraction from the underlying reality, which is that I can go and talk to my neighbors, I can talk to people, despite whatever differences we may have. I have a lot of friends on all sides of this. I've got a lot of friends who are from different countries. It is in my local sense. I live in a multicultural world, and I have a lot of people in my life who have different political leanings, etc. Yet we can still all hang out and talk. And I think that's maybe the reality check here, that if you're led to believe through the theatrics of the mass media that there is some sort of great divide, that there is a river, then you're going to maybe be led, just as Jacques Ellul talks about, you are going to be led into mass formation to see and perceive enemies where there are actually no enemies.
And be blinded to the places where your agency may have some effect. The higher and farther away people are from you, I think we're given to it's like the Wizard of Oz, right? So the Wizard of Oz, we're supposed to, and interesting and very interesting, that story. The wizard is the getting everybody's attention and terrifying them, and telling them to do absurd, ridiculous things. And because they're fixated on it with their eyes, they're ignorant of the man behind the curtain, and I think we need to be a little bit more like Toto, right? And smell,
feel.
Yeah.
Okay. Well, thank you, Andrew. I hope for people listening, there's something in there. I mean, as I said, I'm interested in talking to lots of different people. I'm interested in understanding these things and communicating, and I certainly am hopeful. And whenever I do meet people in real life, on the human to human level, the peer-to-peer level, I always come away with a sense of hope. And I think that's something, if we can all take with us into our daily life, certainly it can help a lot.
Yeah, I surely think and feel the same. Thanks again for the opportunity to converse with you, and I hope you out there are enlightened and inspired by some of our conversation to see the depth of human reflection upon these perennial topics and to dig in, because it's really bottomless and very enriching.
Cool. Thank you very much.
Thank you.